In today's world, where technology surrounds us everywhere, it seems that we have left the difficulties faced by our ancestors in the past. However, when it comes to survival, some of us still look to the past for inspiration, believing that ancient wisdom is the key to salvation. Today, we will talk about medieval English myths about survival, which, if applied in modern conditions, can be deadly dangerous. We will analyze these misconceptions by comparing the knowledge of medieval people with what we know today. We will see how what worked back then will completely fail in our time. Our goal is not to laugh at the mistakes of the past, but to understand why they were mistakes and learn from them to avoid making our own. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how what was considered wisdom in the Middle Ages could cost you your life today. In the Middle Ages, when medical knowledge was very limited, people sought salvation in the most unexpected things. One such remedy was spider webs. They were collected and applied to wounds. It was believed that spider webs had healing properties and could stop bleeding. People believed that spider webs were a natural bandage that would protect the wound. What is wrong with this myth? Let's start with the fact that spider webs can indeed stop minor bleeding, but not because of their healing properties. They simply form a physical barrier that helps the blood to clot. However, if you apply a spider web to a wound today, you risk getting an infection. Spider webs can harbor bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms that cause serious inflammation. In addition, spider web fibers can get into the wound, complicating its healing. In the Middle Ages, when antibiotics did not exist, the risk of infection was high, but people did not know this. They simply saw that the bleeding stopped and believed in a miracle. We know that this is not the case. Our ancestors, deprived of modern medical equipment and knowledge, often relied on traditional beliefs and observations. One such observation was the use of mold. People noticed that in some cases, wounds covered with moldy bread healed faster. They did not understand that they were actually using penicillin, a natural antibiotic produced by Penicillium fungi. This folk method could save lives, but it also carried enormous risks. After all, people could not distinguish between beneficial and harmful mold, and using the wrong fungus could lead to gangrene and death. This is a striking example of how observing nature without a scientific approach could be both a salvation and a deadly trap. Another common misconception was treatment with leeches. They were used for bloodletting, a procedure that was believed to remove bad blood and restore balance in the body. Leeches can indeed be useful, but only in certain cases. In modern medicine, they are used in microsurgery to restore blood flow and prevent blood stagnation after surgery. But in the Middle Ages, they were used thoughtlessly, often harming patients. Excessive blood loss weakened the body, made it vulnerable to infections, and slowed down recovery. Many of these methods seem absurd from the point of view of modern medicine, but they were logical for their time. For example, people used cinchona bark to treat fever. They simply noticed that this remedy helped to lower the temperature. It was only in the 19th century that scientists were able to extract quinine from the bark, an alkaloid that is an active substance effective in combating malaria. This example shows that some folk remedies did indeed have a scientific basis, even though they were discovered empirically. Write in the comments what other unusual folk methods of treatment from the past you know. Today, most of us prefer to sleep in light clothing or without it. We believe that this is more hygienic and comfortable. However, in the Middle Ages, it was perfectly normal to sleep in your everyday clothes, and sometimes even in several layers of them. People believed that this helped them stay warm and protect themselves from the cold that penetrated the house through cracks in the walls. What is wrong with this myth? In modern conditions, this can be dangerous. Sleeping in the clothes you have been wearing all day is unhygienic. Clothes accumulate sweat, dirt, and bacteria. This can lead to skin irritation and infections. In addition, modern clothing, unlike medieval clothing, is often made of synthetic materials that do not allow the skin to breathe. This can lead to overheating, and in the event of a fire, such clothing can melt onto the skin. In the Middle Ages, people slept in clothes made of natural fabrics, such as linen and wool, which were more breathable. But even then, it was not an ideal solution from a hygiene point of view. In a world where every day is a struggle for survival, where there is no electricity, running water, or antibiotics, people are guided by different rules. Their priorities were completely different. They did not think about comfort or hygiene as we understand it, because they were preoccupied with more pressing issues. How to find food, how not to get sick, and how to survive the cold night. This difference in worldview is striking and makes you wonder, what do we consider normal today? And how relevant will it be in a few hundred years? How will we know that modern beliefs about health and safety will also turn out to be just myths? Let's discuss it right now. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh. People could not afford the luxury of having several sets of clothes. Often, they had only one or two outfits that they wore for a long time. Taking off your clothes at night meant exposing yourself to the risk of hypothermia. Houses were not heated like modern apartments, and windows and doors were poorly insulated, so the cold penetrated everywhere. That is why sleeping in clothes was not just a habit, but a necessity. It was their only protection from the bitter cold, which could lead to illness or even death. In addition, people in the Middle Ages did not have access to soap and hot water in the quantities we have today. Regular washing was a rare event, so clothes constantly accumulated dirt, but they had no time for that. Their main concern was to survive, not to be clean. Hygiene as we understand it today simply did not exist back then, and this was not unusual. Dirt and odors were part of everyday life and were treated with much more tolerance. However, even in the Middle Ages, there were attempts to improve sleep hygiene. For example, some people used nightshirts, simple long shirts that were worn over regular clothes. They protected the skin from direct contact with dirt and sweat and were a kind of prototype of modern underwear. But even in this case, nightgowns were not washed every day and still accumulated bacteria. It was a kind of compromise between necessity and comfort that people could afford. If we look at the history of sleep, we see that this practice has changed over the centuries. In ancient Rome, people slept on the floor, on simple mats, and often used animal skin blankets. In ancient Egypt, on the contrary, people slept in light linen clothes to avoid overheating in the hot climate. These examples show that sleeping habits have always depended on climate, culture, and the level of development of society. In a world where every day is a struggle for survival, where there is no electricity, running water, or antibiotics, people are guided by different rules. Their priorities were completely different. They did not think about comfort or hygiene as we understand it, because they were preoccupied with more pressing issues. How to find food, how to avoid getting sick, and how to survive the cold night. This difference in worldview is striking and makes us wonder, what do we consider normal today, and how relevant will it be in a few hundred years? How will we know that modern beliefs about health and safety will also turn out to be just myths? Let's discuss it right now. In the Middle Ages, people living in rural areas often supplemented their diet with what they found in the forest. They knew which berries and mushrooms were edible and which were not. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. The forest was a kind of supermarket for them. They knew where to find edible roots, which leaves could be used to make tea, and where to find nuts. What is wrong with this myth? Today, we have lost this knowledge. Attempting to forage in the forest based on general ideas can lead to tragedy. Many poisonous berries and mushrooms look very similar to edible ones. The same plant species can be poisonous in one area and harmless in another. Medieval people grew up surrounded by nature and learned from their parents and neighbors how to recognize plants. They did not use books or the internet. Their knowledge was practical and proven. We, on the other hand, live disconnected from nature, and our knowledge of it is limited. Even if you find an edible mushroom, it can easily be confused with a poisonous one. In addition, the modern environment is not what it used to be. Plants can be contaminated by industrial emissions or pesticides, so relying on wild food without special knowledge is a deadly risk. Medieval forest and village dwellers did not simply gather whatever they found. They were skilled observers. Their survival depended on how well they understood nature. They knew which plants were edible at certain times of the year, how to process them properly to get rid of toxic substances, and how to cook them to make them nutritious. For example, some types of acorns, which are now considered inedible due to their high tannin content, were used for food in the Middle Ages. People knew that they had to be soaked in water to make them edible. This knowledge was not something that could be read in a book. It was passed down through practice. Children learned from their parents by watching them gather and prepare food. It was part of their education and survival. Unlike us, they had no choice. If the harvest was poor, they had to go to the forest. It was not a hobby, but a necessity of life. However, even in the Middle Ages, mistakes happened. Poisoning from mushrooms and poisonous berries was not uncommon. Human error, inaccuracy in the transfer of knowledge, or simply an accident, all of these could lead to fatal consequences. But overall, their knowledge was deep enough to sustain their lives. With the development of agriculture and urbanization, the need for gathering disappeared. We began to rely on supermarkets and farmers' markets. Our knowledge of the wild has become theoretical rather than practical. We can find information about edible plants on the internet, but this cannot replace years of experience. We cannot just go into the forest and start picking berries because we do not know which ones are actually edible and which ones are not. In addition, modern environmental conditions create additional risks. Forests can be contaminated with industrial waste and plants with pesticides. Even if you find an edible plant, there is no guarantee that it will be safe for your health. This is another example of how the world has changed and how old methods that were effective in the past have become dangerous in the present. These examples show how much the world has changed. Our lives today have become more comfortable and safer, but it is possible that future generations will look at us with the same amazement as we look at medieval people. In the Middle Ages, people often drank ale or cider instead of water. This was not only due to their preferences, but also because the water from rivers and streams was contaminated. Boiling water was considered one of the most reliable ways to make it drinkable. The high temperature killed bacteria and made the water safe. What is wrong with this myth? Boiling water is a good way to kill bacteria, but that is not all that can be in the water. Modern water can be contaminated with chemicals, pesticides, and heavy metals, which boiling will not remove. Moreover, boiling can even increase the concentration of some of these substances. In the Middle Ages, when the chemical industry did not exist, microorganisms were the main problem. Today, we have to deal with a much wider range of threats. Today, we drink clean, bottled water and use filters. But how long will this last? What if tomorrow there are no clean water sources left on Earth? Will we have to drink ale and cider again to survive? And if so, what should we wear to keep warm in this harsh new world? In the Middle Ages, water was a serious problem. Due to the lack of sanitation and running water, rivers and streams were polluted with human and animal waste. This led to the spread of dangerous diseases such as cholera and dysentery. People instinctively understood that raw water could be dangerous. They noticed that alcoholic beverages such as ale and cider were safer. The fermentation process and alcohol content killed many harmful bacteria. Therefore, drinking them was much safer than drinking water. For this reason, even children drank weak ale. It was not a question of addiction, but a question of survival. Another important point is the use of water for cooking. Even if people did not drink it directly, they used it to make soups and stew meat and vegetables. In this case, boiling was the only way to make food safe. They did not know about microbes and viruses, but empirically concluded that high temperatures helped. This was their main weapon against invisible enemies. Today, the situation has changed. We still face bacterial contamination, especially in developing countries, but new threats have emerged. Industrial enterprises, agriculture, and transportation emissions pollute water with heavy metals, nitrates, pesticides, and other chemicals. Boiling not only fails to remove these substances, but can also increase their concentration. For example, when water containing nitrates is boiled, they are converted into nitrites, which are even more toxic. Modern water filters, based on reverse osmosis, activated carbon, and ion exchange resin technologies can remove most of these contaminants. We have created an entire industry to provide ourselves with clean water. But our dependence on these technologies makes us vulnerable. What would happen if these technologies became unavailable, for example, due to a global cataclysm or economic crisis? Would we be able to return to the old methods? And would we even know how to do it? The history of boiling water shows how humanity has evolved from instinctive survival to a scientific approach. We have replaced intuition with technology, but perhaps we have lost valuable knowledge about how to survive without it. This makes us wonder, what will happen if our civilization collapses? Will we be able to survive knowing only how to use technology, but not understanding its fundamentals? And if so, what should we wear to keep from freezing in this harsh new world? Wool was one of the most popular materials in the Middle Ages. It was used to make clothes, blankets, and even furniture upholstery. Wool retains heat very well, even when wet. This was especially important in the damp and cold climate of England. Layered woolen clothing created air pockets, which were the best insulators. What is wrong with this myth? Modern people are used to light and comfortable clothing. Wearing several layers of thick woolen clothing can be very uncomfortable. Wool, especially coarse wool, can irritate the skin. In addition, if you move around, you will quickly sweat, and wet wool, although it retains heat, becomes very heavy and uncomfortable. Today, we have modern materials that are much more effective. For example, fleece or thermal underwear wick moisture away from the body and retain heat. So relying solely on wool in modern survival conditions is not the best idea. However, in the Middle Ages, people did not have the same choices we do today. Wool was an affordable and versatile material. Wool clothing was a status symbol. The thinner and softer the wool, the richer its owner. But even coarse, thick wool was a salvation from the cold. It protected against wind and rain, which was vital for those who worked in the fields or spent a lot of time outdoors. Layering clothing was not just a whim, but a sensible strategy. The bottom layer, usually made of linen, served to absorb sweat. Several woolen tunics or cloaks were worn over it. These layers created air pockets that retain heat well. This principle is still used today in modern technologies, for example, in the production of layered clothing for mountaineers. So medieval people were, in fact, the first technologists of layered clothing, albeit without our understanding of thermodynamics. But wool had another drawback. It was very expensive and labor-intensive to produce. It took a lot of time and effort to turn sheep's wool into a finished piece of fabric. The wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun, dyed, and woven. The entire process took months, and wool clothing was a real treasure. It was cherished, repaired, and passed down from generation to generation. Today we can buy fleece or thermal underwear for little money. These materials are lightweight, breathable, and quick-drying. They are ideal for outdoor activities and sports. But if you find yourself in the wilderness without access to stores, wool is still one of the best options. Yes, it is heavy and can be itchy, but it is reliable and time-tested. Comparing wool with modern materials shows how far we have come in terms of technology. We no longer depend on one or two materials. We can choose what is best for a particular situation. This gives us freedom and comfort that medieval people could not even dream of. In the Middle Ages, people built their homes from whatever was available: wood, stone, clay, and straw. These materials were durable and accessible. Stone walls provided reliable protection from wind and cold. Clay plaster helped to seal gaps and make the walls more durable. What is wrong with this myth? Attempting to build such a shelter in survival conditions is a waste of time and energy. Building such a house can take weeks or even months. In conditions where you need to quickly find shelter to escape the weather, this method is not suitable. In addition, it requires tools that may not be available. Of course, modern people accustomed to comfort and convenience would not build a house out of stone and clay. But what if the apocalypse suddenly arrives and we have to build a shelter with our own hands? Will we be able to cope without modern tools, or will we just freeze in the rain, dreaming of a warm bed and hot tea? And in general, will anything save us if we can't light a fire? Let's talk about it right now. The medieval buildings we see in movies weren't built in a day. It was a long and painstaking process that involved the entire community. Building a house was an event that brought people together, and it required not only time, but also special skills. People knew how to choose the right stone, how to mix clay with straw to make a strong mortar, and how to build walls that would not collapse. This knowledge was part of their culture and was passed down from generation to generation. In a survival situation, when every minute counts, such methods are ineffective. If you find yourself in trouble, you need a shelter that can be built in a few hours, not months. It can be a simple canopy made of branches and leaves, a dugout, or even a snow igloo if you are in cold regions. These shelters are not as strong and durable as medieval houses, but they can save your life. Using natural materials to build a shelter is an art. You need to know which branches are strong, which leaves are waterproof, and how to position the shelter to protect yourself from the wind. This is not something you can learn in a day. Our ancestors had this knowledge because they lived in close contact with nature. They watched animals build their burrows and nests and learned from them. However, there are risks involved. Shelters made from natural materials do not always provide complete protection. Insects, rodents, snakes, all of these can get inside and cause problems. In addition, such shelters require constant updating and repair. Branches can break, leaves can dry out and crumble. Comparing medieval construction methods with modern ones shows how much we have changed. We are accustomed to comfort and safety. We have ready-made materials, tools, and technologies that allow us to build houses quickly and efficiently. But our dependence on these technologies makes us vulnerable. What will happen if we lose access to these resources? Will we be able to return to the old methods? Will we know how to build something that will protect us from the elements? And in general, will anything save us if we cannot light a fire? Fire was the heart of a medieval home. It provided light, warmth, helped to cook food, and protected against wild animals. Fire was a symbol of life and hope. People believed that fire was their best friend in the wild. What is wrong with this myth? Fire is a powerful tool, but it can also be a dangerous enemy. Improper use of fire can lead to a fire that destroys everything around it. In the forest, especially in dry weather, a single spark can turn into a huge fire. In addition, fire requires constant monitoring. You need to constantly add wood and make sure it doesn't go out. This takes a lot of time and effort that could be spent on something else. The history of mankind is, in fact, replete with examples of how fire, long revered as a blessing, turned into the most terrible disaster. In densely populated cities where houses were built of wood, a single hearth could cause a catastrophe. All it took was for someone to fail to notice a coal jumping out of the fire for the flames to spread to dry straw and then to neighboring buildings. Medieval chronicles describe entire cities being wiped off the face of the earth in a matter of hours, leaving only ashes behind. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is one of the most famous and destructive examples, when the flames raged for several days, destroying most of the city, including St. Paul's Cathedral. This disaster forced people to rethink their attitude towards fire, realizing that its power requires not only respect, but also the strictest control. People living in the wild encountered another, equally insidious side of this myth. In damp forests and marshy areas, fire was incredibly difficult to light and maintain. Firewood quickly became damp, and any attempt to fan the flames in windy weather could prove futile. Even if a fire was successfully lit, it could be extinguished by a sudden downpour, leaving the traveler without warmth and the ability to cook food. In such conditions, fire became not so much a savior as a source of constant anxiety. In addition, the bright flames attracted not only wild animals, but also ill-intentioned people who could use it as a guide to track down a lone traveler or a group. Dependence on fire was thus both psychological and physical. A traveler who considered fire to be his only salvation could find himself trapped. He wasted precious hours searching for firewood, forgetting other important tasks such as collecting water or finding shelter. At dusk, when every minute counts, he might panic while trying to light a fire and end up defenseless. This myth created a false sense of security, distracting from real threats and depriving a person of the ability to adapt to changing conditions. In addition, the smoke from the fire itself carried invisible dangers. In enclosed spaces, such as caves or primitive huts, it could cause carbon monoxide poisoning. Inhaling large amounts of smoke over time led to lung and respiratory problems. Thus, what was supposed to warm and protect people was quietly undermining their health. Fire required not only fuel, but also a constant supply of fresh air, which was not always possible in harsh weather or confined spaces. Revisiting this myth allowed humanity to master more complex technologies that did not depend on the whims of fire. Ways to conserve heat without constant burning appeared, for example, by creating more sophisticated shelters and using warm clothing. People learned to prepare food that did not require heat treatment or to use alternative methods such as drying and salting. This gave them greater freedom of movement and independence from the constant search for fuel. Over time, of course, fire became more controllable thanks to the invention of hearths, fireplaces, and stoves, which directed heat and removed smoke, making its use safer and more efficient. But even today, in the age of electricity and gas, the myth of the unconditional saving power of fire lives on. We see it in movies where a hero lost in the woods first builds a fire without thinking about how it might give away his location, attract predators, or cause a forest fire. The real wisdom that history teaches us is not to reject fire, but to understand its dual nature. Fire is a powerful ally when used with respect and caution, but it becomes a ruthless enemy if its power is underestimated. A traveler, hunter, or survivor must learn not only to light a fire, but also to assess when its use is appropriate and when it is not, and always be prepared for the fact that the flame they have lit may turn against them. In the Middle Ages, there were no refrigerators or modern preservatives. People used methods such as drying, salting, and smoking to preserve food for the winter. These methods were time-tested and allowed people to survive in conditions where fresh food was not available. What is wrong with this myth? These methods were effective, but they did not provide a 100% guarantee. During the food preparation process, mistakes could be made that led to food spoilage. In addition, dried or salted meat, if not prepared properly, could contain bacteria that cause food poisoning. Even without modern technology, our ancestors intuitively found ways that we now classify as the use of natural preservatives. Take salt, for example. It not only added flavor, but also created an environment that was unfavorable for the growth of most bacteria. This process, called osmosis, literally drew moisture out of the cells of microorganisms, preventing them from developing. Smoking, in addition to imparting a unique aroma, impregnated the meat with smoke containing phenols and other antibacterial compounds. These substances enveloped the product, creating a kind of natural barrier against spoilage. People also noticed that certain spices, such as cloves, cinnamon, and mustard, had strong antimicrobial properties. They were added not only for flavor, but also to extend the shelf life of products. This was empirical knowledge passed down from generation to generation, a kind of culinary alchemy where each additive had its own practical purpose. Despite all the tricks, ancient methods were not perfect. Salting and smoking often greatly altered the texture and taste of foods, making them tough and incredibly salty. While today we can use a minimum of salt, in the past it was used in excess to ensure preservation. This led to health problems such as high blood pressure and strain on the kidneys due to excess sodium. Drying, in turn, was effective but required certain weather conditions. If the summer was rainy and humid, it was almost impossible to prepare dried fruits, vegetables, or meat. In addition, improperly dried products could become covered with mold, which not only spoiled the taste, but also released mycotoxins that were extremely dangerous to health. With the advent of science, we began to understand that preservation is not magic, but a complex biochemical process. Today, we use vacuum packaging to remove oxygen, which promotes oxidation and the growth of aerobic bacteria. We use pasteurization and sterilization to destroy microorganisms by heating. These methods allow us to preserve the fresh taste and nutritional properties of food, which was difficult to achieve in the Middle Ages. Unlike ancient methods, modern technologies provide predictable and controllable results. For example, preservation in airtight jars was revolutionary, as it allowed food to be stored for months and even years without changing its taste as drastically as salting did. The myth that modern preservatives are always harmful often exaggerates their danger. It is important to understand that many of them are synthesized analogs of substances found in nature. For example, acetic acid, E260, is the same as that found in ordinary vinegar, which people have been using for centuries. Citric acid, E3R30, is a natural component of citrus fruits. Even potassium sorbate, E202, is a salt of sorbic acid, which is found in rowan berries. The modern food industry does not simply add chemicals, but carefully measures and controls their use to ensure product safety and stability. The safety of each preservative undergoes rigorous testing, and their concentration in products is regulated by law. So, the myth that real food does not require preservatives does not stand up to scrutiny. There have always been methods of preserving food based on processing, whether with salt, smoke, or acids. Preservatives are simply substances that prevent spoilage. What matters is not their origin, natural or synthetic, but their effectiveness and safety. Modern technology allows us to enjoy fresh and varied foods all year round, minimizing the risk of food poisoning and nutrient loss, which was impossible for our ancestors, who had to rely on unreliable and labor-intensive methods. Today's preservatives guarantee our safety and give us access to high-quality food, regardless of the season or where we live. In the Middle Ages, people lived in communities. They worked together, shared knowledge, and helped each other in difficult times. Surviving alone was practically impossible. To hunt, build a house, or defend themselves from enemies, they needed the help of other people. What's wrong with this myth? Modern survival culture often romanticizes the idea of solo survival. We see movies and books where the hero overcomes all difficulties alone. But in real life, this is almost impossible. Humans are social creatures. We need other people to share knowledge, for support, and to share difficulties. Trying to survive alone without special knowledge and skills is suicide. The idea of surviving alone as the ultimate manifestation of strength and independence is nothing more than a dangerous myth. It ignores a fundamental truth about human nature. We are creatures that have evolved to work together. Our brains, our social skills, even our language are all tools designed for interaction. One person may possess incredible strength and perseverance, but they can never replace a group. One hunter may struggle to catch small game, but a group of hunters can take down large animals that will feed everyone. One builder will spend months constructing a hut, while a community can build a village in a matter of weeks. In the wild, when trouble strikes, a lone individual often becomes easy prey. They cannot hunt, watch for danger, maintain a fire, and seek shelter all at the same time. All of these tasks require different skills and time. A group, on the other hand, can divide responsibilities, ensuring safety and efficiency. For example, while one person guards the perimeter, others can gather edible plants or build a shelter. This principle remains relevant even in the modern world, where survival can mean not only battling the wilderness, but also overcoming financial crises or recovering from natural disasters. Moreover, survival is not only about physically overcoming difficulties, but also about maintaining mental health. Prolonged isolation is one of the most powerful factors that destroy the psyche. Without communication, support, and sharing emotions, a person quickly loses motivation, hope, and even sanity. We draw strength from our relationships, from the understanding that we are not alone. To give this up is to voluntarily deprive ourselves of the most powerful tool for survival. Thus, the myth of the lone survivor is a trap. Not only is it unrealistic, but it is also dangerous because it creates the illusion that one can do without other people. True strength lies in the ability to unite, trust, and work together, because ultimately it is cooperation, not isolation, that has allowed humanity to survive and thrive for millennia. In the Middle Ages, when there were no compasses or GPS, people navigated by the stars. They knew how to find the North Star and use it to determine north. This knowledge was part of their culture and was passed down from generation to generation. What is wrong with this myth? Navigating by the stars requires practice and knowledge. Without them, you can easily get lost. Today, when the skies of cities are polluted with light, it can be very difficult to find the stars. In addition, the weather may be cloudy and the stars simply will not be visible. So relying solely on the stars is a big risk. The idea that anyone can easily learn to navigate by the stars is a dangerous misconception. To use the stars as a navigational tool, you need to know more than just what the Big Dipper or the North Star looks like. You need in-depth knowledge of the movement of celestial bodies, how they change their position at different times of the year and at different latitudes. Incorrect identification of a single star can lead to an error of several hundred kilometers. Such a skill requires many years of practice, not just a superficial acquaintance. Moreover, orientation by the stars depends on many external factors that a person cannot control. For example, if you are in the northern hemisphere and want to determine north by the North Star, you must be sure that you are actually there. In the southern hemisphere, the North Star is not visible, and you will have to use the Southern Cross constellation for navigation. Weather is another critical factor. Even a thin layer of clouds completely obscures the starry sky. In fog, snowfall, or rain, the stars become invisible, and your only navigational tool becomes useless. In the modern world, there is another serious problem: light pollution. The bright lights of cities, towns, and industrial areas create a veil of light that prevents even the brightest stars from being seen. To find an unpolluted sky, you have to move many kilometers away from civilization, which is not always possible. Thus, relying solely on the stars as a means of navigation is not only risky, but also, in many cases, simply ineffective. A true survivalist must be able to use several methods of orientation rather than relying on just one. We can see that many survival methods that were effective in the Middle Ages can be deadly dangerous today. This shows how much our world has changed and how much we ourselves have changed. What was wisdom at the time may be foolishness today. We must respect the past, but not blindly follow its advice. What other myths from the past would you like to explore? Write in the comments, and we will definitely consider the topics you suggest. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.